A desperate farmer stands in the county courthouse hallway, facing the man who holds his entire future in his hands, the very judge about to rule on his family farm's foreclosure. 3 days earlier, this same judge had been kneeling in the gravel beside Mary Martinez's broken-down car, humbly accepting her help as she fixed his flat tire. Now, with shocking documents that could expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of local power, Mary must decide whether revealing the truth will save her farm or destroy them both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mary Martinez wiped the dust from her weathered hands as she carefully folded the foreclosure notice that had arrived just that morning. The late August heat pressed down on the fertile plains surrounding her small dairy farm outside Westfield County. Fields that had nurtured 3 generations of her family now stood partially withered, caught between drought and mounting debts that threatened everything she held dear. At 53, Mary carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced life's hardships without complaining. Her hands told stories of early mornings and late nights, of pulling calves and mending fences, of grief and determination. The farm's 120 acres had sustained the Martinez family since her grandfather Pedro returned from the Korean War. Unlike the corporate mega-farms that now dominated the surrounding landscape, the Double M Ranch had maintained its independence through sheer will and innovative practices. Mary's late husband James had died suddenly 2 years ago, leaving her to manage both the dairy operation and their small beef cattle herd. Their daughter Rosa was pursuing her law degree at the state university, driven partly by witnessing her parents' struggles with agricultural regulations and bank bureaucracy. Their son Miguel had returned after 3 years in the military, bringing skills but also invisible wounds that made farm work challenging. "You could sell right now," Miguel had suggested that morning, watching his mother review the notice. "Get enough to start over somewhere else, maybe open that bakery you always talked about." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in his young life, who understood that some battles couldn't be won. But Mary had shaken her head firmly. This wasn't just about money or even the land itself. It was about preserving a way of life that fed communities, maintained open spaces, and represented values increasingly threatened by corporate agriculture's relentless expansion. The bank gave her 30 days. 30 days to somehow raise $180,000 or lose everything her family had built over 70 years. The irony cut deep. Double M Ranch had always been environmentally conscious, implementing water conservation techniques before they became fashionable, maintaining wildlife corridors along field edges, and using integrated pest management to minimize chemical inputs. Their products commanded premium prices at farmers' markets throughout the county. Yet despite their success, rising equipment costs, drought impacts, and a single bad harvest had pushed them to the financial edge. Mary walked through the historic farmhouse, running her hand along the polished banister her grandfather had crafted by hand. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. Pedro and Maria's arrival from Mexico, their first harvest celebration. James and Mary's wedding day. Rosa and Miguel's childhood adventures among the animals. Each image represented dreams realized and sacrifices made. Her phone rang, the number unfamiliar but local. When she answered, the voice on the other end spoke with the crisp efficiency of legal training. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Sarah Chen from Legal Aid Services. I understand you're facing foreclosure proceedings. We have a new program aimed at protecting family farms from questionable lending practices. Would you be interested in having someone review your case?" Mary's heart quickened. Free legal assistance seemed too good to be true, especially given the timing. "Yes, absolutely. When can someone come by?" "I can be there this afternoon," Sarah replied. "Say, around 3 o'clock? I'll need to examine all your mortgage documents and communicate with the bank." After hanging up, Mary felt a surge of hope tempered by caution. The bank handling her case, First National of Westfield, had a reputation for aggressive collection practices. Founded by the influential Morrison family 3 generations ago, it had weathered countless economic storms by maintaining rigid lending standards that often favored large agricultural corporations over family farms. She spent the morning organizing her files, gathering bank statements, mortgage documents, and correspondence that had accumulated over the past year. The paper trail revealed a pattern that had troubled her: interest rate adjustments that seemed inconsistent with market conditions, mysterious processing fees that appeared without explanation, and communication delays that coincidentally preceded penalty assessments. As she worked, Mary's mind drifted to her conversation with other local farmers at the monthly co-op meeting. Several had mentioned similar experiences with First National, leading to forced sales that ultimately benefited Agricorp Industries, a conglomerate that had been quietly acquiring family farms throughout the region. The connections seemed too convenient to be coincidental, yet proving any deliberate scheme would require resources and expertise far beyond her means. At noon, Miguel brought lunch to the workshop, where Mary was repairing their older tractor. The newer equipment sat idle, awaiting expensive replacements for parts they couldn't afford. Miguel had become her mechanical apprentice, learning the intricate systems that kept their modest operation running. "Mom, I talked to Rosa last night," he said, setting down sandwiches wrapped in cloth napkins Maria had embroidered decades ago. "She thinks there might be legal grounds to challenge the foreclosure based on predatory lending laws. She's researching precedents in her consumer protection class." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Mary's chest tightened with maternal guilt. Her children shouldn't be sacrificing their own futures to save the farm, yet their support meant everything in this fight against overwhelming odds. Did she mention how we might prove predatory lending? She said we'd need evidence of deliberate manipulation, documentation showing the bank targeted us specifically or altered terms unfairly, Miguel explained, his military training evident in his analytical approach. But gathering proof would require accessing internal bank records, which isn't exactly legal. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when Mary's truck kicked up dust, heading toward the county seat for supplies. Sarah Chen had called to reschedule her visit for tomorrow morning, needing more time to prepare after receiving concerning information about the presiding judge in Mary's case. Judge Harold Thompson had served Westfield County for 15 years, known for his stern interpretation of contract law and methodical approach to foreclosure cases. His reputation preceded him, fair but uncompromising, someone who viewed emotional appeals as distractions from legal facts. Mary had heard other farmers muttering about his tendency to favor banking interests, though no one had concrete evidence of bias. As she drove the familiar back roads, Mary noticed an expensive car ahead, its hazard lights blinking intermittently. The vehicle, a late-model luxury sedan, sat at an angle on the gravel shoulder, clearly disabled. Her first instinct was to keep driving. She had too many problems to stop for strangers. But something in the way the afternoon light struck the scene reminded her of her father's teachings about helping those in need, especially on these isolated roads where assistance might not arrive for hours. Mary pulled over, parking her dusty pickup behind the gleaming sedan. A man in his early 60s emerged from the driver's side, his business attire looking incongruous against the rural setting. His glasses had been hastily repaired with electrical tape, and his normally polished shoes were caked with mud from attempting to change the tire. "Having trouble?" Mary called out, approaching with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades maintaining vehicles under challenging conditions. The man turned, surprise evident on his distinguished features. "My apologies for blocking the road. I attempted to change the tire myself, but the jack slipped and damaged the mounting point. I'm afraid my mechanical knowledge is rather limited." Mary noticed the Alaska license plates and realized the man wasn't local. "Let me take a look. I've changed a few tires in my time." As she circled the vehicle, she recognized the problem. Immediately, the jack had been positioned incorrectly, common for someone unfamiliar with this particular model. "I have a hydraulic jack in my truck that might work better," she offered, already walking back to retrieve it. The stranger followed, clearly relieved, but maintaining a certain formality that spoke of professional habits. "I don't want to impose on your time," he said, watching as Mary selected tools from her meticulously organized toolkit. "I have AAA membership, but service in this area can take hours." "No imposition at all," Mary replied, positioning the jack correctly. "My husband always said character is measured by how you treat strangers, especially when no one's watching." As she worked, the two fell into conversation. The man introduced himself as Harold. He didn't offer a last name, and Mary didn't press. He explained he was visiting the county for business, unfamiliar with the rural roads, but appreciating their scenic beauty. "Beautiful country," he observed, watching Mary's skilled hands make quick work of the tire change. "Farmland, I presume?" "Yes, my family's been farming here for 3 generations," Mary replied, her pride evident despite current circumstances. "Dairy and beef cattle. It's not the easiest life, but there's something special about working land that your grandparents worked." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Family tradition has deep value, though I imagine current economic conditions make it challenging to maintain such operations." Mary hesitated, then decided honesty served best. "It's getting harder. Banks don't seem to understand that farming isn't like other businesses. We can't control weather, market prices, or disease outbreaks, yet they expect payment schedules as rigid as clockwork." "That does seem unreasonable," Harold agreed, genuine interest in his voice. "Surely judges and regulators must consider these factors when reviewing agricultural loans." "In theory," Mary said, tightening the final lug nut. "In practice, they often focus on numbers alone. Foreclosure statistics have quadrupled in this county over the past 5 years. Family farms are disappearing while corporate operations expand." Harold's expression grew more serious. "That's troubling. The consolidation of agriculture has long-term implications for food security and rural communities." Mary lowered the vehicle back to the ground, satisfied with her work. "Well, you're all set. The spare should get you to a service station. Thompson's garage in town can help with a permanent fix." Harold reached for his wallet. "Please, allow me to compensate you for your time and expertise." Mary waved him off. "Just pay it forward. Help someone else when you get the chance." As Harold prepared to leave, he paused, seeming to wrestle with the decision. "Mrs. Martinez," he said finally, having apparently caught her name from the truck's door, where Mary's Milk and More was painted. "I hope your situation improves. Family farms are essential to this country's character." With a final nod of gratitude, Harold carefully maneuvered his vehicle back onto the road. Mary watched until he disappeared around the bend, then returned to her truck. The encounter had offered a brief respite from her worries, though it would be another day before she understood its true significance. That evening, Rosa called with mixed news. "Mom, I've been researching Judge Thompson. He has an interesting history. Started his career as a corporate attorney for agricultural firms before becoming a prosecutor. Some farmers claim his rulings favor banks, but others say he's strictly procedural." "Any recent cases similar to ours?" Mary asked, pulling up a chair at the kitchen table where her grandmother Maria had spent countless hours planning family meals and futures. "3 in the past 6 months, Rosa reported. 2 foreclosures went through without challenge, but there's one pending case that might be relevant, the Johnson property. Similar circumstances to yours, and Thompson granted them a 30-day extension to gather evidence of predatory lending. The information sparked cautious optimism. If Thompson had shown flexibility once, perhaps there was hope for negotiation. What changed in that case? That's the interesting part, Rosa continued. The Johnsons brought in evidence suggesting the bank had manipulated their interest rates through a computer error. Thompson ordered an independent audit before proceeding. Mary made mental notes, her legal education coming through osmosis from conversations with her daughter. So he responds to concrete evidence, not emotional appeals. Exactly. Mom, if you can find any documentation suggesting similar irregularities in your case, I've been through everything twice, Mary interrupted gently. The numbers are confusing, but not obviously wrong. That's where Sarah Chen might help, Rosa suggested. As a legal aid attorney, she has resources for financial forensics that we don't. Just be completely honest with her about everything. After the call, Mary sat in the growing darkness, the weight of tomorrow pressing down. Sarah Chen would arrive in the morning, followed by her first appearance before Judge Thompson at the courthouse. The thought of facing him after their roadside encounter added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. She opened her laptop, a gift from her children that she still found intimidating, and typed Harold Thompson into the search bar. The first result made her breath catch. There he was, the distinguished man she'd helped just hours ago, posing in official judicial robes. The caption read, Judge Harold Thompson to preside over County Foreclosure Court. Mary stared at the screen, her mind racing. The ethical implications swirled. Would Thompson feel obligated to rule favorably because of her help? Would he recuse himself to avoid any appearance of impropriety? Or worse, would he feel the need to appear impartial by ruling against her? She closed the laptop and moved to the window overlooking her grandfather's fields. The moon cast silver, light across the pastures where 3 generations had poured their hearts and sweat. Pedro Martinez had arrived with nothing but determination and the clothes on his back, building this legacy through sheer will and community support. Tomorrow would bring the first skirmish in what promised to be a war for survival. Mary had expected to face institutional powers, banks, corporations, and the legal system in defense of her family's dream. She hadn't anticipated the personal dimension that chance encounter had created. In her bedroom, surrounded by Maria's quilts and family photographs, Mary made a decision. She would tell Sarah Chen about the roadside encounter, but leave the decision to her attorney's professional judgment. Whatever happened, she would maintain her integrity, the same principle that had guided her family for generations. The night passed slowly, filled with memories and possibilities. At dawn, Mary began her day as she had for decades, checking on the livestock, noting the subtle changes in weather patterns that city forecasters often missed, and finding strength in the rhythms that connected her to countless generations of farmers who had faced their own impossibilities. What Mary couldn't know was that her act of kindness had already set in motion a series of events that would reach far beyond her own case. Judge Thompson, alone in his hotel room, had spent the night reviewing his upcoming docket with new eyes, Mary's words about rigid banking systems echoing in his mind. Across town, in a secret meeting room at First National Bank, executives discussed strategies for the Martinez foreclosure. They needed this property badly. Its water rights alone were worth triple the outstanding loan amount. Agricorp had offered significant compensation for ensuring the foreclosure proceeded quickly and quietly. As morning light painted the sky, in shades of possibility, Mary Martinez prepared to fight for more than just her farm. She would fight for the idea that ordinary acts of kindness could still influence the powerful, that truth had value in courtrooms, and that family farms deserved protection from those who would sacrifice them for profit. The stage was set for a David and Goliath battle where the weapons would be facts, character, and the unexpected connections forged on a dusty back road where a desperate farmer had chosen to help a stranger in need, not knowing he was the very judge who would decide her fate. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains as Mary adjusted her best dress, navy blue with tiny white flowers, the same one she'd worn to James's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd bought it for a day of mourning, and now it would serve for what could be either salvation or the death of 3 generations of dreams. Sarah Chen arrived precisely at 7:30, her compact car contrasting sharply with the agricultural setting. She stepped out carrying a leather briefcase that suggested competence despite its worn edges. Mary guessed she was in her early 30s, her movements purposeful yet measured. "Mrs. Martinez, I appreciate you accommodating an early appointment. We have much to discuss before your appearance this afternoon." Sarah's handshake was firm, her eyes already scanning the property with professional assessment. Over coffee in the kitchen, Mary laid out everything: the mounting debts, the irregular interest adjustments, the pattern of escalating fees. Sarah listened intently, taking detailed notes in a shorthand that suggested law school training. "These predatory lending patterns you describe align with cases I've been tracking," Sarah said, reviewing documents with a practiced eye. "First National has been remarkably effective at foreclosing on properties that subsequently sell to Agricorp Industries. In fact, 73% of their agricultural foreclosures in the past 18 months ended with that specific buyer." Mary felt vindicated but also disturbed. "You're saying this is systematic?" "I'm saying the coincidence is statistically improbable," Sarah corrected carefully, "but proving coordination requires evidence of direct communication or shared financial interest. Bank executives are skilled at avoiding paper trails." The attorney's methodical approach reminded Mary of her daughter Rosa, both women wielding facts as weapons against institutional power. Sarah's next question caught her off guard. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you something delicate. Have you had any personal contact with Judge Harold Thompson?" Mary's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected. "Actually, yes. Yesterday, I helped him change a tire on Country Road 12. Neither of us knew each other's identity at the time." Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, though Mary detected a slight tightening around her eyes. "I see. And now?" "He gave me his card, but I hadn't made the connection until last night. I'm not an expert on legal ethics, but I imagine he'll be conflicted," Mary admitted, her voice steady despite inner turmoil. "Indeed." Sarah closed her notebook deliberately. "We have 3 options. First, we can file for recusal based on potential bias. Second, we can proceed knowing he may recuse himself voluntarily. Third, we can hope he separates personal encounters from judicial duties and trust in his professional integrity." Mary considered her grandfather's wisdom about character and courage. "What would you recommend?" "Professionally, request recusal to avoid any appearance of impropriety," Sarah advised. "Personally, I've researched Thompson extensively. He's known for rigid adherence to procedure and separation of duties. If we request recusal, it might suggest we fear his actual judgment rather than the appearance of bias." The weight of decision pressed heavily. "If he doesn't recuse himself voluntarily, let's proceed. We have nothing to hide, and our case should stand on its merits." Sarah nodded approval. "That shows considerable courage, Mrs. Martinez. Now let me examine the evidence I've gathered against First National's practices." While Sarah worked through financial documents, Miguel entered with troubling news. "Mum, I just spoke with Bill Harrison. First National called in his loan yesterday, demanded full payment within 15 days. He's been banking with them for 25 years, never missed a payment." The news hit Mary like ice water. Bill Harrison's farm bordered theirs to the north, one of 4 remaining family operations in what had once been a valley of independent farmers. The timing seemed calculated. "That's intimidation," Sarah stated without looking up from her notes. "They're sending a message to anyone considering resistance. Mr. Miguel, would Mr. Harrison be willing to speak with me? He's afraid. Says he can't afford to fight." Miguel's military bearing barely concealed his frustration. "He has 3 kids in college." Sarah gathered her materials with renewed energy. Fear is their most effective tool. But fear dissipates when people stand together. "Mrs. Martinez, with your permission, I'd like to represent you not just in this case, but as part of a broader investigation into First National's lending practices." The scope expanded exponentially. Mary had entered the morning thinking only of saving her own farm. Now she stood at the threshold of something larger. What would that involve? Depositions from affected farmers, subpoenas for bank records, possibly class action certification if we find sufficient evidence of systematic discrimination, Sarah explained, her voice gaining intensity. It would extend beyond this immediate foreclosure to challenge the entire pattern of rural property transfers in this county. The magnitude of responsibility threatened to overwhelm. I have 30 days to save my farm. Can we fight both battles simultaneously? Mrs. Martinez, Sarah leaned forward, her professional demeanor softening to reveal genuine conviction. In my experience, the only way to truly save your farm is to change the system that threatens it. These institutions count on our isolation, our fear of reprisal, our willingness to accept personal defeat rather than challenge broader injustice. The courthouse clock tower was visible through the kitchen window, its weathered face marking time that seemed both infinite and desperately finite. Mary thought of Pedro and Maria facing their own impossibilities, arriving in a new country without language or connections, building something permanent from nothing but determination. "All right," she said quietly, "let's fight both battles." The decision ignited something in Sarah's eyes, perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit, or simply professional excitement at finally having a client willing to challenge rather than capitulate. They spent the next 2 hours developing strategy, Sarah's questions growing more probing as her list of legal maneuvers expanded. At 10 o'clock, they drove to town in separate vehicles, Sarah heading to file necessary motions while Mary stopped at Thompson's garage to fill her truck. As she pumped gas, watching numbers climb alongside her anxiety, a black limousine pulled alongside, a vehicle so out of place in Westfield that people stopped to stare. The rear window lowered to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Eleanor Morrison. I believe we should speak." Recognition hit immediately. Eleanor Morrison was the widow of First National Bank's founder, a woman whose name appeared on the town's hospital wing, whose family had shaped Westfield's development for a century. Mary approached slowly, aware of curious stares from other customers. "How can I help you, Mrs. Morrison?" "It's how I might help you that concerns me presently," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. "Please, just for a moment. What I have to say requires privacy." Against better judgment but driven by curiosity, Mary climbed into the limousine. The interior smelled of leather and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to her truck's blend of diesel and farm life. "I'm aware of your situation," Eleanor began without preamble. "I was also aware of my late husband's vision for this bank," supporting local families, understanding that agriculture requires patience and flexibility unusual in modern finance. Mary waited, uncertain where this conversation might lead. My grandson now runs First National. He studied at prestigious schools, learned theories about market efficiency and portfolio optimization. Eleanor's voice carried undertones of disappointment. He believes sentiment has no place in banking. The revelation crystallized pieces of a puzzle Mary hadn't realized she'd been assembling. You're saying the current leadership has changed the bank's philosophy? I'm saying that family, tradition, and community welfare have been sacrificed to quarterly profit reports and external partnerships, Eleanor continued. Agricorp Industries has made First National an offer to acquire certain strategic properties. Your farm is on their list. The confirmation of suspicions brought no satisfaction, only increased determination. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor's gaze intensified. Because I spent 60 years as part of this community. My children attended school with your families, patronized your businesses, celebrated your harvests. When my grandson couldn't be swayed by appeals to conscience, I decided to act through other means. From her purse, she produced a manila envelope. Inside, you'll find copies of internal memos outlining the arrangement between First National and Agricorp. Meeting minutes discussing targeted acquisition properties, financial projections showing the bank's anticipated profits from these foreclosures. Mary's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope. This could change everything, or nothing, Eleanor cautioned. These documents weren't obtained through proper channels. Their admissibility in court might be challenged. And those who resist powerful interests face considerable pressure. The limousine's air conditioning ran efficiently, but Mary felt heat rising through her body, the warmth of righteous anger mixing with the chill of implied threats. What do you expect in return? Eleanor smiled slightly. Nothing more than what you're already doing, standing for principles that once defined this community. My husband believed a bank's first responsibility was to its neighbors. I'd like to see that philosophy return to First National, even if it requires external encouragement. After Mary returned to her truck, envelope hidden beneath the seat, she sat for several minutes processing the encounter. Sarah Chen had suggested standing together against institutional power. Now, she held evidence that could expose exactly the conspiracy they'd suspected. But evidence obtained through questionable means might ultimately prove useless, or worse, compromise their position entirely. She drove to the courthouse, arriving early to walk the familiar grounds. The building's neoclassical architecture spoke of intended permanence, its limestone facade weathered by the same forces that shaped the surrounding farmland. During her grandfather's time, locals had known every judge, every clerk, every deputy sheriff. Now the faces belonged increasingly to outsiders. Sarah Chen emerged from the law library, satisfaction evident in her quick stride. "Success," she announced, joining Mary on a wrought-iron bench. "I've found 3 relevant precedents where judges ruled against foreclosure proceedings that showed statistical patterns of discrimination." Mary debated whether to share Eleanor Morrison's envelope. Professional ethics warred with practical necessity. Finally, she revealed the morning's encounter and its surprising conclusion. Sarah's response was measured. Whistleblower evidence has complicated legal implications. We can't use these documents directly without proper chain of custody and authentication. However, her pause carried weight. Knowing what to look for legitimizes our requests for official discovery. These memos reference specific meetings and policies. We can subpoena the originals through proper channels. The distinction mattered legally, but felt hollow emotionally. Truth shouldn't require such complex navigation, yet Mary recognized this was how institutional change often occurred, through patient persistence rather than dramatic revelation. Their conversation was interrupted by Judge Thompson's arrival. He entered through the courthouse's side entrance, walking with deliberate purpose. Though surrounded by the trappings of judicial authority, Mary saw traces of yesterday's vulnerable stranger, the man who'd struggled with a simple tire change while maintaining quiet dignity. Their eyes met briefly. Thompson nodded slightly, professional acknowledgement rather than personal connection. The gesture reassured and worried in equal measure. He would maintain appropriate boundaries, neither favoring nor penalizing her. For yesterday's encounter, the case would proceed on merits alone. Mary and Sarah followed other petitioners into the courthouse, climbing worn marble stairs that had supported decades of legal proceedings. The air smelled of furniture polish and anxiety, that peculiar blend that permeated buildings where fates were decided. Inside courtroom C, Mary recognized several faces, fellow farmers whose cases had preceded hers, their expressions telling various stories of resignation, defeat, or lingering hope. Bill Harrison sat in the back row, catching her eye with a small nod. He'd chosen to observe rather than participate, perhaps calculating the wisdom of staying informed while maintaining low profile. At precisely 2 o'clock, court came to session. Judge Thompson surveyed the room with practiced authority before beginning proceedings. Case number 2024. FC 1847, First National Bank versus Mary Martinez. Counsel, please approach. Sarah Chen moved forward with quiet confidence. The bank's attorney, a tall man in an expensive suit that screamed big city expertise rather than local understanding, joined her at the bench. His name was Richard Lawson, partner at Hamilton and Associates, a firm retained by First National for these matters. This foreclosure proceeding concerns a 180 acres agricultural property held by the Martinez family for 3 generations, Judge Thompson began, consulting his notes. Mrs. Martinez is represented by Ms. Chen from Legal Aid Services. Mr. Lawson represents First National Bank. Shall we proceed with opening statements? The formal language created distance between human drama and legal procedure. Mary listened as Lawson outlined the bank's position. Payments missed, warnings issued, notices served, all according to established procedure. His presentation reduced. Years of struggle to columns of numbers, community connections to contract terms. Sarah's response painted a different picture. Your Honor, we contend that First National Bank has engaged in predatory lending practices, specifically targeting family farms. Mrs. Martinez's case follows a pattern of irregular interest adjustments, unexplained fees, and foreclosure proceedings that ultimately benefit a single corporate buyer, Agricorp Industries. Thompson's expression remained neutral, though Mary detected increased attention. These are serious allegations, Ms. Chen. Do you have evidence supporting a systematic pattern? We've identified 17 similar cases in the past 18 months, Sarah answered confidently. Statistical analysis shows an improbable correlation between First National's agricultural foreclosures and subsequent sales to Agricorp. We request permission to present this data and call witnesses who can testify to similar experiences. Lawson objected immediately. Your Honor, relevance to this specific case is questionable. Mrs. Martinez's contractual obligations stand independent of any alleged patterns elsewhere. The first battle line was drawn. Thompson's ruling would determine whether Mary's case remained isolated or became part of a larger examination of banking practices. He considered both arguments before speaking. I'll allow limited testimony about other cases if Ms. Chen can establish direct similarity to the Martinez situation. However, this is a foreclosure proceeding, not a class action investigation. We must keep focus on the immediate matter while considering broader context, where specifically relevant. The compromise pleased neither side completely, but provided framework for proceeding. Over the next hour, Sarah methodically presented Mary's case. The irregular interest adjustments, the sudden acceleration of payment demands coinciding with crop failure, the selective enforcement of penalties that seemed coordinated with Agricorp's expansion plans. Lawson countered with contract terms, signed documents, clear payment schedules repeatedly explained to Mrs. Martinez. He painted a picture of business necessity, of contracts honored regardless of personal circumstances. The afternoon proceedings revealed the opposing philosophies at war: law as a tool for fairness versus law as a mechanism for predictability. Each side drew from deeper wells: responsibility to community versus responsibility to contractual agreements, human need versus market efficiency. At 4 o'clock, Thompson called for recess. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Before then, Mr. Lawson, I expect First National to provide complete records of Mrs. Martinez's loan history, including all internal communications regarding her account. Ms. Chen, submit your statistical analysis with specific details on comparative cases by end of business today." Mary felt simultaneously encouraged and overwhelmed. The case hadn't been dismissed outright. Thompson was requiring deeper examination, yet the mountain of evidence needed seemed insurmountable within their 30-day deadline. Outside the courthouse, Sarah touched her arm reassuringly. "He's giving us room to make our case. Thompson's reputation for procedural strictness actually works in our favor. Once engaged, he'll follow evidence wherever it leads." Mary spotted Eleanor Morrison's limousine across the street. The elderly woman stood beside it, speaking earnestly to a younger man Mary recognized as her grandson, current president of First National. Their body language suggested heated discussion, the younger man gesturing dismissively, while Eleanor maintained determined composure. "That's Charles Morrison," Sarah confirmed, noticing Mary's observation. "His relationship with his grandmother has reportedly become strained over bank policy disagreements." Whatever arguments Eleanor advanced failed to sway her grandson. He climbed into a separate vehicle and departed quickly, leaving her standing alone. Mary felt a surprising urge to offer comfort. The woman who'd provided crucial information seemed herself isolated by family division. Before Mary could act on the impulse, Bill Harrison approached hesitantly. "Mary, I wanted you to know. I can't publicly join your fight, but I've kept detailed records of every interaction with First National for the past 5 years. Maybe that information could help." Hope kindled. "Bill, your records might establish exactly the pattern we need to prove. Would you allow Sarah to review them?" "Under condition of anonymity, yes," he agreed quickly. "I'll leave them on my porch tonight. Someone can collect them without my direct involvement." Small acts of courage began accumulating. As Mary left the courthouse, she noticed other faces among the dispersing crowd, families whose farms had already fallen to foreclosure, watching with interest as someone finally challenged the system. Their presence suggested both support and skepticism, hope tempered by their own defeats. That evening, Mary called a family meeting. Rosa drove down from university while Miguel helped prepare dinner. They gathered around the kitchen table where 3 generations had faced their own crises. "I need to prepare you both for what's coming," Mary began. "Fighting this battle could strain us financially even if we win. Legal costs, lost productivity, potential retaliation. These are real risks." "Mom," Rosa interrupted gently, "when has our family ever chosen the easy path? Grandpa Pedro left everything he knew to build something here." Grandma Maria opened her kitchen to every family facing hardship. Dad expanded the organic program when everyone said it wouldn't work. Miguel added, "And you've maintained all of that despite losing Dad, despite drought, despite banks that see us as numbers on spreadsheets. We're with you." Their united support fortified Mary's resolve. Yet questions lingered, particularly about Eleanor Morrison's true motivations. Was she a genuine ally, fighting against changes she'd been powerless to prevent internally? Or was this elaborate manipulation, false evidence designed to compromise their legal position? Sarah Chen arrived at 8, accompanied by 2 paralegals, who would assist in organizing the evidence from Harrison's records. They worked late into the night, cross-referencing loan documents, compiling data patterns, building the framework of their expanded case. Around midnight, during a brief break, Sarah shared insight that shifted their perspective entirely. "I've been investigating Charles Morrison's background. He wasn't originally in banking. He earned an MBA specializing in agricultural commodities, then worked directly for Agricorp Industries before returning to manage the family bank." The revelation connected final dots. The arrangement between First National and Agricorp wasn't external partnership, it was vertical integration. Charles Morrison hadn't changed the bank's philosophy. He'd weaponized it for his former employer's benefit. Armed with this understanding, they refined their strategy. Tomorrow would require more than defending Mary's individual case. They needed to expose the systematic betrayal of community trust, the transformation of local institutions into tools of corporate agriculture. As Mary finally prepared for bed at 2 a.m., she stood at her window watching moonlight paint silver. Across fields her family had tended for generations. The irony struck sharply. She'd helped Judge Thompson yesterday, believing she was showing basic human kindness. Now that simple act had created the complex foundation upon which fairness might rest. Dawn would bring either progress toward justice or confirmation that power ultimately triumphed over principle. Yet Mary recognized that win or lose, standing for truth carried its own victory. Her grandfather hadn't fled poverty to build comfortable surrender. Her parents hadn't sacrificed everything to establish easily abandoned principles. Tomorrow, in that courthouse where declarations had shaped community destiny for over a century, Mary Martinez would fight not just for acres of land, but for the idea that ordinary acts of decency should count for something in halls of power, that neighbors should matter more than profit margins, that justice might still recognize humanity. The ancient clock tower chimed 3 times, marking hours that passed whether seized with purpose or surrendered to fear. Mary chose purpose, knowing that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. Whatever dawn would bring, she would meet it standing, as a daughter of people who had built something enduring from hope alone. Morning mist rose from the valley as Mary arrived at courthouse precisely at 8:30, dressed in the same navy blue outfit, but carrying herself with newfound resolve. Sarah Chen waited at the entrance, accompanied by someone Mary hadn't expected to see, Professor Robert Chen from State Agricultural University, Sarah's father and arguably the county's most respected authority on rural economics. "Professor Chen is here as our expert witness," Sarah explained, noting Mary's surprise. "His research on agricultural lending patterns has been cited in several federal cases." The professor, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver temples and compassionate eyes, extended his hand. "Mrs. Martinez, your courage in confronting these practices will benefit countless farming families. I've been studying similar patterns across the country, but it's rare to find someone willing to challenge the system publicly." Inside the courtroom, the day's proceedings began with Lawson presenting First National's evidence. He distributed ledgers showing Mary's payment history, highlighting the 3 missed payments that had triggered acceleration of the loan. His presentation was methodical, calculated to present legal necessity as unfortunate inevitability. "The bank has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders," Lawson argued. "Emotional considerations cannot override contractual obligations." Mrs. Martinez was fully aware of the consequences when she failed to meet her payment schedule. Judge Thompson absorbed the information with characteristic analytical attention. When Lawson finished, he turned to Sarah. "Miss Chen, please present your counter-argument." Sarah stood, projecting calm authority despite the challenge before them. "Your Honor, we'll demonstrate that First Nationals' contractual obligations were themselves manipulated to ensure this precise outcome. We called Professor Robert Chen to testify about the statistical improbability of current foreclosure patterns." Professor Chen took the stand with academic dignity. His testimony began with dry statistics, but quickly revealed damning patterns. "In analyzing 17 comparable cases," he explained, "we find a 97% correlation between First Nationals' agricultural foreclosures and subsequent sales to AgriCorp Industries. This exceeds statistical probability by factors, suggesting coordinated rather than coincidental outcomes." Lawson objected repeatedly, challenging methodology and relevance, but Judge Thompson allowed the testimony to continue. The professor's analysis grew more compelling as he detailed specific manipulations, interest rate adjustments that coincidentally peaked during drought years, processing fees that miraculously appeared when farmers showed signs of recovery, and loan modification offers that invariably included terms impossible to meet. "What you've described suggests systematic targeting," Thompson observed, "but how does this connect specifically to Mrs. Martinez's case?" Sarah seized the opening. "We request permission to present evidence recently obtained showing direct correspondence between First National and AgriCorp regarding Mrs. Martinez's property." The courtroom stirred with anticipation. Lawson immediately protested. "Your Honor, any such evidence should have been disclosed in discovery. Its late introduction is both irregular and suspicious." Mary's stomach knotted. They'd agreed to use Eleanor Morrison's information only as a guide, not direct evidence. What was Sarah doing? Thompson considered the objection carefully. "Ms. Chen, explain the timing of this evidence and its origin." Sarah answered with careful honesty. "Your Honor, we received information yesterday evening from a confidential source within First National's administrative structure. The source wishes to remain anonymous due to fear of professional retaliation. This information led us to file specific subpoena requests this morning for official documentation." "And those subpoenas?" First National's legal department claimed they were processing the requests, but indicated the documents might not be available for weeks due to archival retrieval processes, Sarah explained. The courtroom's atmosphere charged with tension. Mary realized Sarah was forcing Judge Thompson to choose between strict procedure and material truth. The gambit could backfire spectacularly or break the case open. Thompson's next words came, slowly, weighted with judicial significance. "In matters affecting community welfare, courts must balance procedural rigidity against equitable access to truth. I'm granting Ms. Chen 48 hours to secure official documentation through emergency judicial order. However," he fixed her with a stern gaze, "failure to produce verifiable evidence will severely impact your credibility and potentially result in sanctions." Lawson's objection died in his throat. The judge's ruling, while seemingly balanced, had effectively acknowledged the possibility of misconduct serious enough to warrant emergency measures. During recess, Mary confronted Sarah in the corridor. "You risked everything." "No," Sarah corrected firmly. "I risked procedure to preserve substance. Eleanor Morrison's documents won't be admissible, but they give us roadmap to find the smoking gun. Judge Thompson's emergency order means First National must comply within hours, not weeks." Eleanor Morrison herself appeared, having apparently monitored proceedings from the public gallery. Her regal bearing had acquired determined urgency. "Ms. Chen's right. My grandson's assistant called this morning. They're already destroying records. Mrs. Martinez, you need to know. Charles has accelerated timeline. He plans to force sale of your property to Agricorp within 10 days, regardless of court proceedings. The revelation staggered Mary. He can do that. The law provides certain provisions for expedited sales when financial institutions feel their interests are threatened, Sarah explained gravely. If implemented, we'd have to fight to reverse a completed transaction rather than prevent it. Eleanor continued, I'm told Charles has scheduled emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. He needs board approval for the expedited sale. Without it, he must wait for normal proceedings. The chess match accelerated exponentially. They needed evidence to legitimize their case by tomorrow morning, or risk losing through procedural maneuvering rather than judicial ruling. The board meets at First National's downtown office, Eleanor added meaningfully. Charles has invited only his allies. Several longtime board members weren't notified. Back in court, afternoon session intensified. Sarah systematically built case through careful questioning, establishing pattern of targeting that began with Charles Morrison's return to manage family bank. Former bank employees testified under subpoena about policy changes. Subtle pressure to prioritize certain accounts, bonuses tied to foreclosure completion rates. Mary testified herself, walking judge through every interaction with First National's representatives. She described how payment schedules had been inconsistently applied, how loan officers had encouraged specific farming practices that inadvertently made her more vulnerable to market fluctuations, how modifications offered always included poison pills, making acceptance impossible. Judge Thompson's questions grew more pointed. Mr. Lawson, these practices your witnesses describe seem unusual for a community bank. How do you explain the transformation of lending policies coinciding with Mr. Morrison's leadership? Lawson struggled to maintain composure. Market realities require adaptation, Your Honor. Agriculture faces unprecedented challenges. Banks must modernize their approaches to remain viable. Even when modernization appears suspiciously aligned with one particular buyer's interest, Thompson pressed. Correlation doesn't establish causation, Lawson replied, invoking the shield of statistical uncertainty. The legal dance continued until 5 o'clock, when Thompson announced, Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Mr. Lawson, First National has until midnight to comply with emergency document request. The integrity of our local financial institutions affects more than individual property disputes. If evidence of systematic abuse exists, this court will examine it thoroughly. Outside, as courthouse crowd dispersed, Mary noticed unusual gathering. Farmers who had lost properties to foreclosure mingled with those still fighting. Local business owners who had witnessed communities' transformation joined the informal assembly. Word had spread about nature of proceedings, drawing diverse audience united by concern about their valley's future. Bill Harrison approached with visible courage. Mary, I've decided. I'll testify tomorrow if needed. My silence helps no one. 3 more farmers stepped forward with similar commitments. The tide of fear that had kept community fragmented began shifting toward cautious solidarity. Eleanor Morrison observed this gathering with practiced eye. Community mobilization was my husband's greatest concern when founding the bank. He believed institutions survived only through public trust. Charles has forgotten that fundamental principle. As darkness fell over Courthouse Square, Sarah outlined next day's strategy. They needed documented proof of coordination between Morrison and Agricorp before emergency board meeting. Without it, even supportive testimony might prove insufficient. To prevent expedited sale. I have an idea, Miguel announced, joining the group. My unit served with several guys who now work private security. One of them mentioned taking jobs at First National recently, extra precautions around sensitive areas of building. Sarah's eyes sharpened. "When does his shift begin?" 10 tonight. Building security rotates every 12 hours. Minimal staffing overnight. Just 2 guards patrolling mostly empty building." The discussion that followed tested ethical boundaries. Breaking into bank vault would constitute criminal behavior. Yet allowing destruction of evidence through legal manipulation seemed equally wrong. The dilemma of fighting injustice while maintaining legitimacy created wrenching conflict. Finally, Sarah proposed middle path. "We know emergency judicial order mandates document production. If First National fails to comply by midnight, we have grounds to request federal marshals seize requested materials, but federal response could take days we don't have." "What if," Rosa suggested with lawyers' careful passing, "someone observed whether required documents were actually being secured as ordered or potentially destroyed in violation of judicial mandate? Witnessing destruction of evidence isn't illegal, it's practically a civic duty." The rationalization felt thin but necessary. Mary found herself agreeing to plan that would have horrified her conservative grandfather. Yet Pedro Martinez had also taken extraordinary actions when circumstance demanded, leaving everything familiar to forge new future in unknown land. Sometimes survival required calculated risk. That night, Miguel and 2 carefully selected observers positioned themselves near First National's building. They weren't breaking in, merely documenting whether bank was complying with court order requiring preservation of evidence. The distinction mattered legally, even if it felt disingenuous morally. Inside bank, Carlos Morrison had indeed ordered systematic review of files related to Agricorp. Employees worked late, following instructions to consolidate and organize. Documentation, the semantic gymnastics thinly disguised real purpose, eliminating paper trail connecting banks' foreclosure practices to corporate buyers' interests. Miguel's contact among security guards confirmed suspicious activity. Shredding machines ran continuously despite late hour. Cardboard boxes labeled archival storage were carried not to storage areas but to loading dock where disposal company waited. At 11:30, Miguel called Sarah with urgent update. "Document destruction is happening now. Large-scale operation. They're literally watching clock, probably plan to finish before midnight deadline." Sarah made critical decision. "We need to act immediately." Rosa called Judge Thompson's emergency service number. "Explain we have evidence of ongoing document destruction in violation of court order. Request immediate judicial intervention." Rosa hesitated only briefly before making the call. Judge Thompson, roused from sleep but grasping the urgency, issued verbal order for immediate cessation of any document handling at First National pending morning hearing. He directed courthouse security to deliver written order immediately. The race against midnight took on new dimension. Miguel described scene inside bank building through second-floor windows. Frantic activity as employees tried to complete destruction before judicial order arrived. Stack of documents awaited shredding, representing potential evidence of years of coordinated activity. At 11:47 p.m., courthouse security arrived at First National with written order. Bank representatives initially claimed building was closed. No one inside. Only when security threatened to note their refusal to accept judicial order did they unlock door. "Documents weren't destroyed," Miguel reported with satisfaction, "but they're scattered everywhere. Filing system completely disorganized. Looks like hastily abandoned crime scene." Next morning brought packed courtroom as community gathered to witness unprecedented proceedings. Judge Thompson's typically composed demeanor showed controlled anger as he addressed First National's representatives. "Last night's events have transformed this hearing's scope," he announced. "We now face questions not just of individual foreclosure, but potential obstruction of justice." Charles Morrison himself took stand, defending actions as routine file maintenance. His confident demeanor cracked under Thompson's methodical questioning. When presented with witness statements describing midnight shredding operation, Morrison's explanations grew increasingly implausible. You maintain that consolidating documents for an archival system upgrade required shredding original materials rather than scanning or photocopying, Thompson asked incredulously. Industry best practices suggest, Morrison began. Thompson cut him off. Industry best practices don't include destroying evidence pursuant to judicial order. Sarah then presented devastating revelation. Among documents saved from destruction, investigators had found copy of internal memo explicitly outlining AgriCorp acquisition strategy, including specific properties targeted for foreclosure. Mary's farm featured prominently, along with detailed financial projections showing bank profits from expedited sales. Professor Chen was called to analyze the memo's implications. This document reveals coordination transcending normal market relationships. First National wasn't merely responding to economic conditions, they were actively creating those conditions to generate specific outcomes. Lawson's defense crumbled under weight of evidence. Denials gave way to technical arguments about memo's context, but underlying coordination was undeniable. First National had transformed from community institution into acquisition tool, systematically undermining farms to consolidate ownership under AgriCorp's control. The emergency board meeting at First National proceeded simultaneously with court proceedings. Eleanor Morrison, despite Charles's attempts to exclude her, exercised rights as founder's widow to attend. Her presence unsettled other board members, many of whom had served faithfully but been kept ignorant of recent policy changes. Using information relayed from Rosa's contacts monitoring the meeting, Sarah informed Court of Board's discussions. Charles Morrison was advocating immediate approval of expedited sale process, arguing that court's investigation would damage bank's reputation regardless of outcome. Better to complete transactions quickly and survive potential penalties. Judge Thompson's response carried judicial thunder. This court will not permit completion of potentially fraudulent transactions pending full investigation. Effective immediately, I'm issuing restraining order, preventing any property transfers between First National and AgriCorp Industries until these matters are resolved. The courtroom erupted with suppressed excitement. For first time, legal system had acted decisively to protect community interests against institutional power. Mary felt tears she'd held back for months, relief mixed with vindication, gratitude edged with exhausted triumph. But victory remained incomplete. Thompson continued, "The broader questions raised here require more extensive investigation. I'm referring this matter to state banking regulators and requesting federal investigation into potential RICO violations. First National Bank will remain under enhanced oversight pending resolution." Charles Morrison, finally understanding his complete exposure, left courtroom pale and shaken. His grandmother Eleanor followed, touching his arm in gesture that combined comfort with consequence. Whatever private conversation occurred between them in courthouse corridor remained confidential, but both emerged changed. Charles's arrogance replaced by dawning accountability. Eleanor's determination softened by grandmother's mercy. That afternoon, with immediate threat lifted, Mary stood in her kitchen, surrounded by family and supporters. Sarah Chen had already filed paperwork to formally stop foreclosure proceedings, though full resolution would take months. Professor Chen was drafting policy recommendations to prevent similar exploitation elsewhere. "You didn't just save your farm," Sarah told her. "You've potentially changed how agricultural lending operates across this entire region." Miguel's radio crackled with ranch reports. Other farmers now openly discussing their experiences with First National, comparing notes on suspicious practices, planning coordinated legal action. Fear's grip was loosening as truth emerged into daylight. Eleanor Morrison's limousine appeared at edge of property. She emerged alone, walking across fields she'd known since childhood. Mary met her halfway, two women representing different generations and perspectives, united by love for land and community. "I want to apologize," Eleanor began simply, "for not acting sooner, for allowing family loyalty to blind me to moral responsibility." Mary gestured toward horizon, where grandfather's original 40 acres had grown into family legacy. Family loyalty isn't wrong, but sometimes it requires standing against family to preserve real values. That evening, Judge Thompson received an anonymous envelope containing complete set of documents Eleanor had previously provided, now annotated with detailed explanation of their origins and significance. The materials wouldn't be admissible in court, but they would guide official investigation toward verifiable facts. As sun set over valley painted gold with coming harvest, Mary stood where she'd helped Thompson change his tire 4 days earlier. The chance encounter had indeed changed everything, but not through judicial favoritism or personal obligation. Instead, it had catalyzed community awakening, farmers finding voices, institutions facing accountability, justice discovering path through complex realities. Robinson Crusoe once observed that a grain of corn could save a man's life. In Westfield County, act of simple kindness had preserved something equally vital: hope that ordinary decency could still influence halls of power, that communities could resist corporate dissolution, that family farms remained worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as investigation proceeded, as bank faced restructuring, as farmers rebuilt without predatory pressures. But for now, in fading light of historic day, Mary Martinez allowed herself moment of profound gratitude for ancestors who'd built foundation worth defending, for daughter and son who'd stood with her, for unlikely allies who'd emerged from unexpected places, and for judge who'd maintained integrity even when personal connection complicated professional duty. The fight for Willow Creek Valley was far from over, but its direction had fundamentally shifted. Sometimes history pivoted on moments so small they passed almost unnoticed. A tire changed on dusty road, envelope of evidence delivered by conflicted conscience, community discovering courage hidden beneath years of isolation. Mary knew her. Grandfather would have understood perfectly. Pedro Martinez had crossed borders believing in possibility of better future, built through honest work and mutual support. His granddaughter had defended that inheritance not through surrender to overwhelming force, but through persistence grounded in same fundamental principles. As darkness settled over farmland that tonight belonged securely to next generation, Mary Martinez prepared for battles yet to come, legal proceedings, economic pressures, community healing, with confidence born from proven belief that sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance begin with simple kindness offered to stranger beside the road. The story continues tomorrow, when federal investigators arrive to examine not just individual case, but systemic patterns threatening rural America. When David finally faces Goliath with evidence, community solidarity, and determination that no single judge could provide alone, but which a judge of integrity could validate through proper channels. Tonight, however, was for gratitude, family, and quiet recognition that courage often wears humble clothing, and justice sometimes arrives through convergence of ordinary choices made by extraordinary people who refuse to surrender what their parents built, their children deserve, and their community requires to survive changing times with soul intact. 6 months after that transformative day in court, Mary Martinez stood in her restructured farmhouse that now served as headquarters for the Westfield County Agricultural Protection Coalition. The organization had grown beyond anyone's expectations. attracting farming families from 6 surrounding counties who'd experienced similar predatory lending practices. The morning sun illuminated frames on the wall, newspaper headlines documenting the unfolding investigation. First National Bank president indicted. Agricorp executives face RICO charges. Small farms find voice through organized resistance. But Mary's favorite wasn't a headline. It was a letter from Judge Harold Thompson announcing his retirement to head a new judicial review board focusing on agricultural lending practices nationwide. "Mom, the federal investigators are here," Rosa called from the porch. Her daughter had taken a leave from law school to help manage the coalition full-time, finding practical education in real-world justice that no classroom could match. The investigation had expanded dramatically from its initial focus. What began as examination of First National's practices revealed interconnected web of financial institutions, corporate agricultural conglomerates, and sometimes complicit regulatory officials across multiple states. The Department of Justice had launched Operation Farm Shield, investigating coordinated schemes to force family farm consolidation. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez led the federal team, her credentials including agricultural economics expertise that bridged the gap between complex financial crimes and farming realities. She'd spent the morning interviewing Mary, meticulously documenting how individual experiences connected to broader patterns of institutional abuse. "Mrs. Martinez, your detailed records have proven invaluable," Agent Rodriguez acknowledged. "The loan modification demands, inconsistent interest applications, strategic timing of penalties. You documented everything. Most victims don't maintain such careful records." "I learned from my father," Mary explained. "He taught us that memory fades, but written records preserve truth." The federal presence brought renewed hope to farming communities that had suffered in silence. Investigators had subpoenaed files from 17 banks across 7 states, uncovering evidence of coordinated practices that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. First National's scheme was pattern, not exception. Eleanor Morrison entered the farmhouse, having become unexpected ally in exposing banking sector corruption. She'd testified extensively before federal grand jury, using insider knowledge to guide investigators toward crucial documentation. The cost to her family name weighed heavily, but she carried herself with dignity of someone choosing principle over comfort. "The federal prosecutor believes they have sufficient evidence for conspiracy charges," Eleanor shared. "Taking coffee," Rosa offered. "Charles has agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentence. He's providing names of executives at other institutions who participated in similar schemes." The domino effect gained momentum daily. Bank employees came forward with stories of pressure to meet foreclosure quotas, of bonuses tied to expediting property transfers, of training sessions, teaching how to legally manipulate vulnerable farmers. Several had recorded internal meetings, creating audio evidence prosecutors needed to establish criminal intent. Miguel, who'd found purpose in agricultural advocacy, was organizing security for today's press conference. The coalition had received threatening messages, not just from financial interests, but from residents who feared disrupting existing power structures would destabilize entire communities. Change always created resistance, especially from those comfortable with status quo. At noon, farmers gathered from across region to share their stories with national media. The coalition had established Speakers Bureau, ordinary people transformed into eloquent advocates through necessity. Each testimony added weight to collective demand for systemic reform. Bill Harrison, who'd overcome initial fear to become vocal reformer, described psychological manipulation banks employed. "They convinced us foreclosure was our personal failure, that drought, market crashes, rising costs somehow reflected our inadequacies as farmers. We competed against each other instead of recognizing we faced common institutional predator. His words resonated powerfully. Shame and isolation had been banks' most effective weapons, keeping farmers from organizing, until problem grew critical. Mary's decision to fight openly had broken that silence, inspiring others to speak despite fear of retaliation. The press conference drew unexpected attendee. Charles Morrison appeared at periphery, accompanied by Eleanor. He'd lost considerable weight, his previous arrogance replaced by something resembling humility. When reporters recognized him, cameras swung his direction. Eleanor had prepared him for this moment. "I want to acknowledge," Charles began carefully, "my role in implementing predatory practices that harmed this community. I allowed professional ambition and corporate pressure to override ethical obligations inherited from my grandfather's values." His direct confession stunned assembled farmers. Several had expected continued denial, making his admission powerful catalyst for dialogue. Eleanor guided him toward a group who'd suffered most directly from his policies, facilitating conversations that might have been impossible months earlier. Judge Thompson arrived for the press conference, having driven from state capitol where he was establishing judicial task force on agricultural lending reform. His presence legitimized farmers' grievances, transforming local dispute into national conversation about rural America's economic survival. "What happened in Westfield County represents systemic failure," he addressed gathering, "but also extraordinary community courage. Mrs. Martinez's determination to challenge injustice, combined with this community's collective action, provides model for meaningful reform." His words carried weight precisely because they came from someone who'd maintained judicial neutrality throughout proceedings. Thompson hadn't favored Mary because of their roadside encounter. If anything, he'd been stricter to avoid appearance of bias. His support now reflected evidence, not emotion. Sarah Chen used press conference to announce coalition's next phase: legislation requiring transparency in agricultural lending, establishing farmer advocacy positions within regulatory agencies, and creating emergency funds to prevent foreclosure bankruptcies during economic crises. Several state legislators attended, pledging support for comprehensive reform package, but triumph remained tempered by ongoing struggles. Not all farmers could wait for legislative solutions, even with immediate threats addressed long-term. Economic pressures continued threatening rural communities. Corporate agriculture's efficiency advantages hadn't disappeared, merely their illegal acquisition tactics. That afternoon, Mary met privately with Professor Robert Chen to discuss sustainable farming initiatives that could improve family farms' economic viability. His research combined traditional knowledge with technological innovations, creating models that preserved autonomy while increasing productivity. "Victory against predatory lending is necessary but insufficient," the professor explained, spreading research papers across kitchen table. "Family farms need economic models that compete fairly with corporate operations. We're developing cooperative structures for equipment sharing, joint marketing, collective bargaining that reduce costs while maintaining independence." The conversation expanded to include Rosa, whose legal background merged with agricultural economic studies. Together, they outlined framework for regional food systems that could support premium pricing for sustainably produced goods, creating reliable income streams for family operations. As evening approached, Miguel returned with concerning news. Private security firm had been hired by AgriCorp to protect their remaining interests in region. Local sheriffs confirmed increased surveillance of coalition members' properties. The battle for hearts and minds continued alongside legal proceedings, but farmers had learned from experience. Instead of fear, surveillance generated determination. They established citizen patrols, neighborhood watch programs, and communication networks that actually strengthened community bonds. What corporate interests intended as intimidation became catalyst for deeper solidarity. At sunset, Mary walked property lines where her crops now flourished, thanks to soil remediation made possible by emergency agricultural recovery grant secured through coalition's advocacy. The contrast with previous years' desperation felt surreal, yet she recognized transformation's fragility, achieved through extraordinary circumstances that couldn't guarantee permanent security. Eleanor Morrison joined her contemplative walk, having stayed to witness day's developments. "My husband would have been proud of what you've built," she reflected. "Not just saving your farm, but preserving vision of banking as community service, rather than profit extraction." They paused where Mary had changed Thompson's tire during that fateful encounter. The spot had acquired almost mythical significance in local law, where chance meetings sparked movement for justice. Simple kindness had indeed changed everything, but only because community chose to act on possibilities that kindness revealed. "I often wonder," Eleanor continued, "if my grandson's transformation is genuine or calculated legal strategy." Mary considered the question carefully. Perhaps both. Fear of consequences might initiate change, but genuine remorse must sustain it. The important thing is, he's helping expose broader corruption now. Their conversation was interrupted by arrival of caravan, families from neighboring states who'd heard about Westfield's successful resistance. They came seeking guidance, support, perhaps hope that their own struggles might find resolution. The coalition had become more than local organization. It represented possibility that ordinary communities could challenge institutional power and prevail. As darkness settled, coalition volunteers served dinner to visiting families in restored, barn converted into community center. Stories overlapped, similar experiences of manipulated loans, mysterious fees, pressure to sell to specific buyers. Each account reinforced patterns investigators were documenting, building case for broad systemic reform. Judge Thompson addressed the gathered crowd, sharing perspective gained from examining hundreds of cases nationwide. "What you've accomplished here transcends individual victories. You've demonstrated that rule of law means nothing without citizens willing to demand its proper application. Your courage creates precedent. Others can follow." Later that night, Mary sat with Rosa and Miguel in kitchen where 3 generations had planned family futures. Federal investigation's scope continued expanding, now encompassing tax fraud, interstate commerce violations, even potential connections to foreign investors seeking to control American agricultural land. "It's bigger than we imagined," Rosa reflected, reviewing legal documents that grew more complex daily. The system didn't fail. It was deliberately hijacked to consolidate ownership. Miguel's military experience had trained him to think strategically about large-scale operations. The question isn't just stopping current corruption, but creating safeguards to prevent future manipulation. We need structural changes, not just individual prosecutions. Mary listened proudly as her children analyzed challenges that would define their generation's relationship with land, community, and corporate power. The fight she'd initiated would require ongoing vigilance from younger voices willing to carry forward values their ancestors had established. The following morning brought unexpected development. Warren Fitzgerald, new president of First National Bank, appointed by federal regulators, requested meeting with Mary. He'd worked previously at community banks focused on microfinance in developing countries, bringing perspective sharply contrasting with his predecessor's corporate mentality. "Mrs. Martinez," Fitzgerald explained in Mary's office, "I'm tasked with rebuilding First National's relationship with this community. That requires acknowledging past wrongs and implementing meaningful reforms. I'm proposing creation of agricultural advisory board comprising local farmers who will influence lending policies and ensure practices align with community needs." The offer represented potential healing, though Mary remained cautious. Trust required demonstration through action, not merely promises. She agreed to participate while maintaining appropriate skepticism. The meeting was interrupted by Sarah, Chen rushing in with news from federal prosecutors. They've secured cooperation from 3 more bank executives. The conspiracy reaches interstate banking associations, involves coordinated manipulation of agricultural commodity markets. They're looking at potential billion-dollar settlements. The magnitude continued overwhelming. What began as Mary's desperate attempt to save her family farm had uncovered financial criminal enterprise affecting rural communities nationwide. Her individual struggle had become catalyst for systemic exposure and reform, yet Mary recognized that sustainable change required efforts beyond legal victories. She proposed comprehensive initiative combining economic development, education, and community building. The federal settlement funds would be directed toward establishing Agricultural Innovation Center, providing low-interest loans for sustainable technology adoption, supporting farmer-to-consumer direct marketing programs. Professor Chen volunteered to lead educational component, developing curriculum that preserved traditional knowledge while incorporating modern scientific understanding. Your grandfather's water conservation techniques were ahead of their time. We need to document and share such innovations before they're lost to corporate monoculture. Eleanor Morrison, seeking active redemption, pledged her personal wealth to establish scholarship fund for rural young people pursuing agricultural education. My family's legacy shouldn't be measured by bank profits, but by how we supported those who feed our communities. 6 months of sustained effort began producing visible results. Property values stabilized as foreclosure pressures eased. Local businesses reported increased activity as farmers gained economic security. School enrollments in rural districts, which had been declining for years, began stabilizing as families felt confident building futures in region. The spring planting season brought symbolic power to transformation. Seeds went into ground with different feeling than previous years. Hope replacing desperation, community solidarity replacing isolation. Mary's fields produced record yields, using regenerative practices that improved soil health while reducing input costs. On one afternoon in late March, Judge Thompson visited while on circuit court rounds. He'd requested private meeting away from public attention that now surrounded his involvement in agricultural lending reforms. "I wanted to thank you personally," he told Mary, walking beside her through growing crops. "Not for the tire assistance, though, that remains appreciated, but for maintaining courage when surrender would have been easier. You forced me to confront how legal procedures can sometimes obscure rather than serve justice." His admission carried particular weight. Thompson's reputation for strict procedural adherence had earned respect even from those who disagreed with his rulings. That this judge had evolved through encountering Mary's situation suggested that change remained possible even in seemingly rigid systems. As summer approached, Coalition prepared for first annual Agricultural Resilience Festival celebration, combining harvest traditions with vision for sustainable farming future. The event would feature farmers' market, educational workshops, policy discussions, and cultural performances honoring rural heritage. Federal investigation continued methodically, with monthly reports of additional indictments and institutional reforms. But coalition leadership recognized that lasting change required focus beyond punishment. They worked to build cooperative networks, share resources, develop markets that rewarded sustainable practices. Mary's story had been captured by documentary filmmakers, written about by national magazines, studied by academic researchers examining grassroots movements in modern America. Yet she maintained steadfast connection to daily farming routines, milking cows before dawn, monitoring weather patterns, adjusting plans based on soil conditions that no academic theory could fully predict. One evening, while reviewing seasonal planning with Miguel, they received visit from unexpected source. James Morrison III, Charles's teenage son, appeared at their door asking to speak privately. "My father sent me," the young man began hesitantly. "He wanted to apologize directly, but thought you might not receive him. He asked me to say he's dedicated himself to helping farmers rebuild trust in banking institutions." The next generation was already inheriting consequences of their elders' choices. Mary invited James to join dinner, using the opportunity to explain agriculture's challenges and rewards from perspective his privileged upbringing hadn't provided. As harvest season arrived, Mary stood in fields where golden grain swayed in late summer breeze, the land her grandfather had claimed through sheer determination, that her father had expanded through innovation, that her husband had helped sustain through drought and hardship, now flourished under her stewardship, preserved, not through luck but through courage to demand justice. She thought of Howard Thompson's words about character being revealed through actions when no one's watching. That dusty roadside encounter had indeed been such moment, choosing to help stranger in need despite personal crisis. The subsequent revelation of Thompson's judicial authority could have created awkward obligation or manipulative leverage. Instead, it had forged authentic connection between two people committed to proper functioning of institutions they served. Thompson had demonstrated that judges could acknowledge personal kindness while maintaining professional integrity. Mary had shown that citizens could stand for principles without demanding special favors. The setting sun painted fields in amber. Light as Rosa and Miguel joined their mother in surveying land they'd fought to preserve. 3 generations of sacrifice had created foundations strong enough to withstand corporate predation, institutional corruption, economic pressure. What would Grandpa Pedro say if he could see this now? Miguel wondered aloud. Mary smiled, remembering her father's careful translation of Pedro's stories. He'd say that soil remembers those who treat it with respect, that community endures when people defend each other as fiercely as they protect their own property, that justice delayed is worth pursuing regardless of how long it takes. Across valley, lights flickered on in farmhouses that might have been replaced by corporate facilities if not for coalition's intervention. Each light represented family choosing to continue tradition despite challenges that seemed overwhelming months earlier. Inside courthouse, where their battle had been fought, federal investigators continued documenting evidence that would reshape agricultural lending throughout country. In bank boardrooms, new leaders worked to establish policies reflecting community, service rather than extraction. In state capitals, legislators drafted reforms inspired by Westfield County's successful resistance. The story that began with flat tire on Lonely Road had grown into movement for economic justice across rural America. Mary Martinez, who had simply wanted to save her family's farm, had become a reluctant symbol of what was possible when ordinary people chose extraordinary courage. As darkness settled and stars emerged above endless plains, Mary returned to farmhouse filled with family members, coalition organizers, visiting farmers, and young people drawn to renewed sense of agricultural purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Legal proceedings continued, economic pressures remained formidable, climate change threatened traditional practices. But tonight was for gratitude and recognition that sometimes moments of pure human kindness create ripples extending far beyond their initial circumstances. Mary had changed Judge Thompson's tire, asking nothing in return. He had repaid that kindness by maintaining judicial integrity when personal obligation might have created complicated conflicts. Together, along with countless others who had chosen courage over surrender, They had demonstrated that American democracy's promise that ordinary citizens could challenge powerful interests and prevail remained alive in small communities, where people still believed in helping strangers beside the road, preserving family legacies, and fighting for justice, not just for themselves, but for everyone who shared their values and struggles. In the end, that was the most powerful legacy of all, not just saving one farm or exposing one conspiracy, but proving that communities united by principle and sustained by mutual support could still reshape systems that seemed immovable, could still demand accountability from institutions designed to serve rather than dominate, could still ensure that future generations inherited not just land, but the values and courage necessary to protect it. The stars above had witnessed this transformation many times throughout history, ordinary people rising to confront injustice, prevailing through persistence and principle rather than power and privilege. Tonight in Westfield County, those eternal patterns had manifested once again, reminding everyone that sometimes the greatest stories begin with simple choices made by humble people who didn't realize they were about to change everything. Uppy. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.